Ghost of Tsushima is a love letter to the samurai film genre and Japanese culture, developed by Sucker Punch Productions and released in 2020 as a Sony PlayStation 4 exclusive, with a PS5 upgrade now also available. I suppose it goes without saying that the whole fact of a Western American studio developing a game so steeped in the culture of an absolutely different nation is a dodgy proposition, to say the least. Even if it would have been a game about an European country, there's just so many subtle differences between us and the people from the USA that are incredibly easy to get wrong, and here we're talking about Japan, which is subject to a lot of stereotypes, including a very romanticized depiction of the samurai that Ghost of Tsushima itself uses as a foundation for its story. So even though I was absolutely enthralled by the game, my first point of research was to understand how the developers have approached the Ghost of Tsushima's creation, especially considering that there are a lot of inaccuracies and creative liberties taken, most of them deliberate, like the whole historical context that's used as a thematic element rather than a factual one. But I can say that from what I saw in the interviews and GDC talks, the developers from Sucker Punch have approached this whole aspect of developing a game about another culture with a lot of care, hiring and constantly implying cultural advisors into their work to create what would indeed be a respectful artistic representation of Japan. That said, even though I appreciate the amount of thought and intention that has clearly gone into Ghost of Tsushima's creation, I am a white Eastern European man. I too am not a part of the culture this game is focusing on, so you have to always keep that in mind whenever I dissect something related to that. I will try my best though to be as fair as I always am. For example, while to me composing haikus in this game feels like an incredibly serene, peaceful activity, to you it might feel out of place due to being anachronistic and the verses themselves not always following the point a haiku should. The latter part doesn't take away anything from my personal enjoyment, but I am fully aware that it might from yours. And I will try to mention those discrepancies whenever I can, like how the samurai fantasy is used to create engaging gameplay, but also how different the samurai cast actually was in real life compared to the romanticized representation that's at the root of this game. But also how those differences are handled in the story. So prepare for a pretty long video breaking down a ton of elements from Ghost of Tsushima. Make no mistake, this game definitely deserves that amount of attention. Now, I should note that even though the Director's Cut expanded version is clearly the definitive way to play Ghost of Tsushima as a whole, this particular video will dissect only everything related to the base version. The multiplayer Legends mode and the Iki Island expansion introduced in the Director's Cut are going to be discussed in separate videos. Legends represents a pretty different utilization of Ghost of Tsushima's core mechanics, and Iki Island, though it is integrated into the main campaign, not only is a pretty considerable expansion of its own in terms of size, there are quite a lot of design differences that will be interesting to talk about on their own terms. Anyway, with this pretty long introduction now out of the way, let's begin. My name is Stanislav Costiuc, I am a game designer, and this is my review of Ghost of Tsushima. As always, we'll dissect it with the help of my Stasocritic scoring system, the first category of which is design. This is the most important part of Stasocritic with the biggest weight, as the way a game is structured and played is really what defines our experience the most. The entirety of Ghost of Tsushima revolves around the samurai fantasy in its romanticized form, but in the context category we'll talk about how the game tackles the more complex questions regarding historical samurai. But this is not just a samurai game. This is a title where, to save people of Tsushima from an overwhelming invading force, the protagonist Jin Sakai has to abandon his code and make use of tactics and weapons one could find dishonorable. Stealth assassinations, dirty tricks, explosive tools, and so on, thus grappling with his transformation into the titular ghost persona. What's really curious about Ghost of Tsushima is that it's not a game with the two thematic pillars standing beside each other, samurai and ghost. No, Ghost of Tsushima starts with one core pillar, that of the samurai, with a number of sub-pillars within it like combat, stealth, and the like. But at the beginning you can use stealth only to avoid being seen and have absolutely no tools that you can use in combat or outside of it. That is only you and your sword. And that's the only way you can deal with the invading Mongols, openly and directly. The game even makes a point of that in the tutorial section, where Jin outright refuses to hide and calls out the Mongols to fight him, and the standoff mechanic becomes an important part of that behavior.
We can get close. slit their throats, and kill them without a sound.
Without honor, I will not break my code.
Face me, invader!
But as the game progresses, the Pillar of the Ghost slowly and gradually overtakes the Samurai Pillar, and that affects all the gameplay aspects within. Stealth is no longer just about avoidance, you can now actually assassinate from behind, with the first such kill being an incredibly difficult moment for the character. And even after gaining this ability, the assassination animations are quite long, until you upgrade your Tanto Blade, which eventually will make stealth assassination kills incredibly fast. And then you get all those tools and moves in combat that allow you to be even more efficient. And this is how the game makes the Ghost Pillar overtake the Samurai one. Not by forcing to use tools like smoke bombs or kunai or any other dishonorable method through adding enemy immunity restrictions or something like that, but by making these tools incredibly effective. Most of the time you'll be alone against dozens of Mongols or more, with the enemies having increasingly better armor as you progress. And sure, you can fight them honorably just with your sword and bow every time. Or you can throw down a smoke bomb and instantly chain kill assassinate 3 of them, and then use kunai to stagger other warriors and kill them faster. Maybe finish everything up by attaching a sticky bomb. And now suddenly what could have been a pretty long fight transformed into a short skirmish. Of course, there is still balance involved. The game makes its ghost actions and tools either consumable or contextual, so you can't just always use them. But at the same time, it gives plenty of opportunities to do so, and as you progress through the game, those tools only become more powerful in nature. So Ghost of Tsushima not only makes the transformation from a samurai into the ghost the premise of the entire character arc in the narrative, that is also the premise of the entire player arc in gameplay, and that happens naturally. This is an absolutely fantastic representation of a central concept through gameplay. That said, are the actual gameplay mechanics, the moment-to-moment actions, any good? Well, as a matter of fact, yes, and we're going to tackle all the most important aspects starting with combat. The romanticized samurai fantasy once again is at the core of how the systems are designed. Combat in Ghost of Tsushima is about discipline and precision. Your standard melee attacks strike only one enemy at a time, and the light attack is very quick, you can do multiple strikes within just a couple of seconds. However, not only does spamming quick attacks make each consecutive strike slower, enemies tend to get into defensive mode after several hits, blocking your weapon. The most straightforward way to get enemies out of that defensive state is to use heavy attacks, which are actually not slow. They're not as fast as normal attacks, but they're still pretty quick. Heavy attacks do stagger damage, meaning that by using them several times you will break through the block and stagger the opponent. They're rendered inactive for several seconds, allowing you to make deadly strikes as a staggered enemy receives more damage. That's the basic pace of combat, and Ghost of Tsushima puts layers upon layers on it to add the aspects of depth and skill mastery. First, of course, you are incredibly rarely put into a 1v1 situation, it's usually fights against a group. So while you're attacking one enemy, another will for sure try to strike. In this situation, you can either parry or dodge, and in some situations you absolutely have to dodge as there are attacks that you can't block or parry. Both moves allow you to get some extra hits in, but if you press L1 just before the enemy weapon connects, you perform a perfect parry, which instantly staggers the opponent. What's pretty cool about the way group combat is set up in Ghost of Tsushima is the fact that enemies feel aggressive, even though underneath it all they actually attack the player one by one as to not overwhelm them. This is achieved through pretty long initial wind-ups. You can see that before starting an attack, the enemy usually needs time to run up to the player, and then the first animation of their combo attack is pretty slow too. This gives players enough time to respond while retaining the feeling of enemies being aggressive and not just standing there doing nothing while they wait for their turn to attack. And the game can sort of stack these long wind-ups on top of one another, so while one Mongol is still in the process of initiating their attack, another one can already start their approach, but they won't strike until the situation with the first one is resolved. What's not cool about the way group combat is set up in Ghost of Tsushima is how the camera works there. A big complaint regarding the original release of Ghost of Tsushima was the lack of a lock-on button, which was added in a post-launch patch, but I would go as far as say that the lack of lock-on was never the problem. In fact, lock-on makes the style of combat, which revolves a lot around switching often between different enemies, more cumbersome to play. The actual problem is the fact that the camera is not dynamic, or rather not dynamic enough. In most cases it will zoom out just a tiny bit, but very rarely will it show the proper full situation with most of the enemies on screen. It also doesn't try to push itself in the direction of enemies, and your opponents don't seem to prioritize getting into screen view before attacking, which can lead to cases where you literally lose sight of enemies or don't know that some are participating in a group fight. The exceptions are archers, which are handled very elegantly. First, they make an audio cue before firing, but also, since for accessibility purposes using only audio is not enough, enemies duck when archers are about to fire, so you know when you have to dodge. There is also an accessibility option available in the menu should you need even more explicit visual cues. So archers add another layer to combat, but that's not the end of it. There are also stances. You start the game only with one fighting stance, but as you progress you unlock more. And these stances not only give you access to new moves, like for example holding the heavy attack button in the default stone stance leads to a piercing attack, while doing the same action in wind stance activates the typhoon kick, but also they make you effective against different types of enemies. So for example, the stone stance heavy attacks are very good at staggering only swordsmen, but won't be effective against other types of soldiers. If you want to stagger shieldmen faster, for example, you have to use the water stance. Not only that, heavy attacks interrupt enemies if you're in the stance that's effective against them, so with enough skill and timing you can actually stay in the offensive quite a lot. And of course, when you need to change stances, time slows down so you would have a moment to properly process which stance to select. The advantage of this system is that the game can create interesting combat situations just by sending different combinations of soldiers your way. But what's great about stances is that, because what the effect is stagger damage and not actual damage, they don't trivialize enemy archetypes to a matter of always matching the stances, as the special moves can be useful against a variety of enemies. Typhoon Kick, for example, works against all normal-sized soldiers, not just spearmen, and later you can get a skill which adds a stun to the kick, allowing you to perform a one-hit kill after. It's a widely applicable tactic, not just against spearmen. So stances have the basic goal of providing you as a player clear strategies you can use against enemies, but also on a deeper mastery level they actually increase the amount of choices you can do in fighting situations, which is incredibly important. So with that in mind, Piercing Strike is a powerful attack that can be used on anybody who doesn't have a shield or can't use one against you at the moment. And you don't have to use flurry strikes only on shielded enemies. Yes, it staggers shieldmen best, but it is still a good way to deal considerable damage quickly on any type of opponent. In fact, you might want to use it against brutes, for example, as even though Moonstance is great at staggering them, it's not always great at dealing damage to them. Not to mention there are brutes with shields, so you don't even need to switch to Moonstance for those. And this aspect gels so well with the overall fantasy of a samurai becoming the ghost. Stances are introduced as something that has concrete rules, use a particular stance against a particular type of opponent. But the depth and mastery of this system comes from learning when and how to break the rules, as that's what ultimately will make you a more effective fighter. The next layer of combat is Resolve. In the beginning, you can use this resource that you gain by parrying and killing enemies only to heal yourself during combat, but later on in the game you unlock special powerful combat techniques. It's a consumable resource that has a symbiotic relationship with core player actions. Because you don't lose it between encounters like usually happens with an adrenaline-like system, you can wait for the opportune moment to utilize Resolve, but also it can be connected to pretty powerful abilities, as to get Resolve back you would need to participate in the core combat or stealth loops. And then of course there is the standoff mechanic, where before you start an encounter you can call out enemies to try and defeat you in a single sword strike. Timing is everything in this risk versus reward mechanic. If you strike too early, you will lose almost all your health, but if you attack at the proper moment, then you gain a lot of resolve. At first you can do this only with one opponent, but later on you can upgrade this ability enough that you can kill 5 opponents through standoff. And it's another great way Ghost of Tsushima combines its fantasy with a mechanic that has different potential reasons for you to use it. Plus, of course, there is the Ghost Show layer, which we have already touched upon when we discussed the game's pillars, so I'm not going to repeat myself here. But I should mention that just like with all other game mechanics here, every ghost tool is something that gradually unravels itself. Sticky Bomb, for example, it's an effective tool, but at first it also damages you, so you have to make sure to not be in its radius after throwing. However, there is an upgrade that makes you immune to the bomb's damage, and after purchasing it, you can immediately become much more aggressive with the bomb's utilization, adding more choices to your ever-growing arsenal of tactics. And all this is without me even mentioning a myriad of little details that help make the combat so consistent. For example, you can cancel out absolutely any animation except that of the finishing kill, but also you will never be attacked while doing such an animation. You might have noticed I said unlock later in the game or unlock as you progress quite a lot. That's because Ghost of Tsushima really eases you into its combat systems. At first you have only the absolute basics available to you, which are satisfying enough, and then the whole breadth of this system unravels as you master the mechanics available. And the progression is so gradual that you don't even have access to range combat at the beginning. You receive your bow only in one of the first main missions after completing the whole prologue that is quite lengthy. I don't have as much to talk about archery as I had about melee combat though. It's a quality system. Your arrows travel in an arc, so you need to take distance into account, and the game's UI with the little stripes beneath your targeting reticle can help you learn to understand where they need to be located for the arrows to hit. The head hitbox on enemies is quite large, so you don't need to be incredibly precise when doing headshots, but some enemies wear helmets and your default bow is ineffective for piercing them, but will still work if you hit the part of the face not covered by the helmet. Again, there are different mechanics that open up as you progress, like various arrowhead types or the slow-mo concentration action. There is not as many as with melee combat, but enough to add more to your choices and playstyle. If there is one thing that's problematic with archery, it's the fact that when you switch up weapons or arrowheads while holding the firing trigger, you have to put the bow back down and up again to draw the arrow, which messes up the flow a bit, but it's a very minor issue. Archery of course can be used not only in combat, but stealth as well, which is the second big gameplay aspect Ghost of Tsushima implements incredibly well. Stealth is always a tricky beast because it needs to have extra clear rules to feel fair, otherwise it can be frustrating. Ghost of Tsushima is a great example of such crystal clear rules. For example, no unalert enemy will detect you if you're crouching one story above them. So you can be sitting on a yurt, which is not at all structure or anything, but still remain undetected by people below you. The only way they will detect you is if they're in alert state after noticing a dead ally or searching for you after you have escaped, in which case you need to stay at least 2 stories above to remain undetected. Then, a detection by a lone enemy won't actually alert people in the vicinity immediately. If you manage to silence them before they yell, which can be either done by shooting an arrow to their head or quickly killing them in melee combat before they can react, you will stay stealthed. This also naturally means that if they detect you while you are killing them, you're safe. And even if it takes too long for you to take care of an enemy and the ones nearby do become alert, they won't actually know your position until they have a direct line of sight with you. If an enemy is not in a hostile state yet but sees a body of one of their allies, they will first approach them and then, after several seconds, will take out a horn to call everyone to their location and set an alert state. Again, the rules for this are extremely clear, so when it's happening you not only know how to prevent this, but also can use it to your advantage and lure enemies that way. Clear rules also apply to your stealth tools. For example, a wind chime is going to attract only a single enemy regardless of how many others there are near them. Though of course, to add some believability, other enemies in the group will still turn around if you throw it too close to them, but only one enemy will approach regardless. If you want to attract a group of people, then you need firecrackers for that. There are other types of little mechanical affordances. For example, air assassination doesn't have to be performed only from a static position above an enemy when the prompt is available. If a guard is a bit too far, you can actually jump towards them and press the air assassination prompt on your way down. And speaking of assassinations, what is really appreciated in Ghost of Tsushima and is really easy to get wrong is the consistent length of animations. Now, I've already mentioned closer to the beginning that when your Tanto is level 1, your animations are longer than if your Tanto is level 3. However, what I also should mention is that all animations of a particular level are practically the same length. So when your Tanto is level 1, your stealth kill will take about 5 seconds to perform. But in level 3, when your blade is extra sharp and Jin feels more comfortable with this type of tactic, it's quick, effective stabs, practically 1 second in length. It's not exact of course, but absolutely close enough so you always know how much time is needed for an assassination to succeed, whichever level your Tanto is. Which by the way can still work as the move even a little bit after enemies enter combat state, as yet another affordance to make sure all these mechanics feel very consistent. And there are many. Shoji assassinations have a pretty generous range and will always teleport the enemy close to the door upon activation, smoke bomb effect lasts a little bit after the actual smoke disappears, and so on. Honestly, the only real criticism I have of Ghost of Tsushima's stealth is the fact that standard assassination and chain assassination require two different initial inputs, as opposed to a single input that is then either continued in a chain or stopped depending on if you keep pressing the buttons or not. Though the activation ranges are generous, sometimes it is possible to overestimate how close enemies are, and instead of killing at least one of them, you just do a heavy attack instead and enter combat. But, for the purposes of fairness, despite assassinations being considered a dishonorable method of dealing with enemies, putting single and chain assassinations as two different button prompts is in line with overall samurai gameplay fantasy focused on discipline and precision, which means being attentive and deliberate with your actions. Another interesting aspect of stealth is the fail condition. Unless it's a quest with a specific narrative connotation, usually you don't lose by getting detected. However, you can lose if the Mongols kill a prisoner or hostage, and this once again is something that works from multiple perspectives. First of course being the reasoning why Jin as a character would start using the dishonorable sneaky method, so the Mongols wouldn't be able to execute anyone. But also from gameplay perspective, the hostage is not killed immediately when you're detected. A soldier is chosen randomly to run towards the civilian, but you can always intercept them on the way if you're fast enough. And even after they reach the hostage, the enemy will wait for a while before striking to make sure that before losing the game due to hostage's death, you have to fail multiple times. Like standoffs, it's another cool combination of fantasy and mechanics. When it comes to other core gameplay mechanics, they're not as advanced as combat or stealth. Horses are needed mostly for navigating long distances. While there are mounted combat mechanics, they're very basic and honestly not that comfortable to utilize. The enemies themselves try to dismount before entering combat, and even a single hit kicks you off your horse. Ghost of Tsushima itself prefers you to fight on foot. With navigation, things are a bit more detailed. You have a pretty free rein in terms of controlling your jumps and their distance, and Jin is magnetized towards branches, ropes and ledges, so you don't need to be very precise. It's basic, but it feels like you have a lot of control, which makes it enjoyable enough. As opposed to actually climbing cliffs, which feels very floaty. The thing is that to climb cliffs you need to only push the stick in a particular direction and wait for Jin to jump where needed, and it just feels like you're not in control. In strike position to literally the rest of the game where you have precise control over every Jin's action. To be fair, sometimes you do need to press jump manually while climbing, but it would have been better had it been a regular action. However, just like with most other systems, there is a bit of progression there. At one point you receive a grappling hook, which adds more engagement to navigation because you have to time at opportune moments when to use it, although also with very generous windows, because the game doesn't focus on navigation as a core gameplay aspect, but a means to an end. Now, despite us talking about combat and stealth for quite some time, there's still a considerable number of mechanics related to them that I haven't mentioned. I don't want to spoil those openly, though throughout the video you will notice their existence in the UI. Ultimately, detailed discussion of these mechanics won't add anything I haven't already mentioned. How Ghost of Tsushima clearly defines its samurai fantasy being overtaken by the Ghost one through addition of very qualitatively done powerful mechanics that add layers upon layers of depth and player choice without forcing to use any of them. Which leads us to more detailed discussion about the game's progression. Ghost of Tsushima starts out with a set piece where you're one of 80 samurai fighting against an overwhelming Mongol invasion force. This is purely a section about moving and basic fighting. You don't have a health bar, resolve, none of that, just you fighting enemies. After that, you have a section that's only about stealth movement. Now, sometimes the game doesn't quite make it clear enough where exactly you have to go in the segment, which can lead to unfortunate situations related to opening the wrong doors, but the point is, the game doesn't try to overwhelm the player with mechanics. And only after the player is familiar with those, Ghost of Tsushima introduces the health and resolve mechanics, as well as teaches all the combat basics like parrying, dodges, and the like. Only after the prologue does the game introduce different open-world related mechanics like the navigational wind and calling your horse. This is also when the game introduces the XP point system, represented as how widespread your legend is across Tsushima. And only then do you get access to the skill tree for which you get technique points. But the skill tree is far from full at the beginning. You can upgrade essentially only skills that you already know. To get new skills like archery or assassination, you have to complete story missions, and to get access to a lot of new ghost tools, you have to increase your legend. In other words, reach a certain XP threshold. Now, I gotta say, I love this, especially considering that all this is very neatly connected to the game's narrative and main character's arc. Very often, especially nowadays, there is a tendency to try and introduce all mechanics as soon as possible, but Ghost of Tsushima spaces everything out, allowing you to properly take in absolutely every new development. The game also handles its RPG progression very elegantly, allowing you a great deal of freedom in customizing your character and approach to problems without having a front-facing level system and focus on character sheets and the likes. First, in terms of enemies, they do have different level tiers, but they're never represented numerically on HUD, but rather through the color of enemy clothing combined together with the amount of armor they have. So you can clearly visually see which enemies are more difficult to take down. And enemy tiers are not just about them getting harder to kill, they gain new moves, longer combos, special abilities. This ranges from a simple numerical change like more skilled archers firing 3 arrows in a row rather than 1, to passive abilities like setting weapons on fire, to new attacks like a polearm sweep. So as you progress through the game, you have to keep adapting to new enemy tactics you will encounter. Then, even though you have weapon upgrades as well as character stat modifiers through charms and armor, there is never a concrete number that is shown to the player, either abstract bars or just a text representing the overall change. You feel everything through gameplay rather than through what number pops out of an enemy. It should be noted that there is another system in place. Every enemy has a maximum amount of hits they can take regardless of their internal health stat or player's damage stat. So for example, the strongest archetype of tier 1 will die from 8 unupgraded sword hits regardless, and as you upgrade, this maximum will eventually become 4 hits. And this process is propagated towards all enemy level tiers, which means that as long as you upgrade your sword by collecting resources in the open world, you will never have to hit any enemy more than 10 times before they die, avoiding that bullet sponge feeling. This is also applied to duels, which are essentially boss battles. The difference between duels and standard combat is that you can't use your ghost tools throughout the battle, only your sword and its different combat stances and moves. And enemies are made more dangerous not by amplifying their health, but rather by making them faster, more aggressive, and taking longer to get staggered. But such bosses will still go down after a pretty small amount of successful hits. It is very intense and definitely a gameplay highlight every time due to the contrast in pacing and camera position. There is a relatively small amount of armor in this game, but each has different gameplay properties. Ghost armor, for example, increases the chance of enemies getting terrified after you kill someone. Terrified enemies are essentially incapacitated by fear for a very long amount of time and usually run away, but sometimes can get back into combat, though not unless you finish them as they lie in fear. Ghost armor also increases detection time. By upgrading it, you can increase the effectiveness of these modifiers, and one thing I would like to note which is great is that upgrading your armor doesn't permanently change the way it looks, but rather adds a different visual option, so you're still free to change its appearance while retaining all the upgraded stats. Just a very nice quality of life feature there, so you wouldn't have to sacrifice aesthetics you prefer for better stats. Every armor is designed for specific purposes. There is a set that's best suited for archery, there is armor that transforms you into a sort of tank in combat, so even when taking damage you get resolve, but there's also armor that has less protection but makes you strike harder in combat. And each set has many particular situations where you can find them useful, you don't have to stay with one armor the whole game. All these stats can be augmented even further through charms. Now, I must say that in the base Ghost of Tsushima, charms, even though the unique ones you get by completing shrines, aren't anything particularly interesting, just an additional way to modify your character's stats towards the playstyle that you prefer. So if you want, you can make the aforementioned Terrify tactic even more efficient by equipping a charm that increases the likelihood of enemies getting terrified from skills and armor that cause that state. Or maybe you would like to focus on quickly staggering enemies, or on a wider amount of stats jack-of-all-trades kind of situation. The choices are there. I must say that the most useful charm is definitely the one that gives you additional resources from the open world. It streamlines the process of upgrading your weapons and armor, though honestly I've got to say that it would have been better had this charm been cut and the whole economy balanced like it would have been constantly activated, as then you're able to comfortably upgrade everything you have by the time Act 3 comes to an end without being too overzealous with resource collecting. But anyway, despite their lack of uniqueness and a lot of very similar ones that you will receive throughout the adventure, charms are quite harmless. Their inclusion doesn't make the game worse, and they're still useful in helping to tune the character towards your preferred playstyle. So if you take a look at everything we have discussed so far, the game lays a very strong thematic foundation on which a set of really intricate and well thought out systems are built, all connected with very good progression and way to customize and fine-tune everything to be in line with your preferred playstyle at any moment in time. Where Ghost of Tsushima actually stands on shakier grounds is in how it handles its open world design, where the game can't quite decide which principles it wants to follow and sort of hurts itself in the process. You might have noticed already that Ghost of Tsushima tries to be as minimalistic with its UI and HUD as possible. This leads to a number of decisions focused on crystal clear visual language. For example, dens where you find foxes that lead you to shrines of Inari that increase your charm capacity are all located near golden trees bustling with fireflies, which you can easily notice in the distance. Locations where you can compose haiku, an incredibly serene activity where you have to choose lines inspired by nature around you, and sometimes the butt of your horse should you decide to stand in a particular spot. They're all signified by songbirds flying over them. Enemy camps all have very thick black smoke coming out of them, which you can see from a very far distance, while side quests and survivor camps tend to have smaller, thinner white smoke. All these points of interest have very clear visual identifiers, and in case you happen to not see any but are near an undiscovered location, a yellow bird will appear to guide you to that place. The way this bird works is very clever, as first it tries to capture your attention regardless of your movement or camera direction, and only after you start following it around will it move towards the point of interest. Though sometimes sadly the bird moves in weird paths that you can't follow directly, so you have to learn to understand how it moves. However, if you need to take a longer way around, even backtrack a bit, the bird will try to stay close to you. There is also a very cool waypoint system that works for any location you've pinned on the map, as well as all active quest waypoints. It's not a compass, nor is it a line on a minimap. Rather, it's wind. And I gotta say, this is very impressive on many levels. First, it's elegant from the design standpoint. The wind always pushes in the direction where you have to go, and besides the grass and tree movement, you always see different leaves and other types of particles moving towards your goal. But also, if you swipe up on the touchpad, the wind gets stronger with very clear line effects. Second, this wind mechanic is very impressive both from visual and technical perspectives. The amount of objects, clothes, particles in the world that are affected by it is just so huge, it is not an easy task to implement. But anyway, combine that wind with the fact that in every camp or settlement there is at least one person who is going to give you a hint towards a side quest, marking its start point on the map after that conversation, and we have on our hands a very great open world focused on discovery and diegetic clues. The dichotomy within Ghost of Tsushima is that despite these principles that are very clearly focused on HUD's design and exploration, the actual open world progression is very icon-based and completionist in nature. First, there's the menu entry for absolutely every activity type that tracks if you have completed all of them in the game or not. Well, of course this doesn't force you to do all of them, it still pushes you towards that goal. As does the fact that whenever you clear a Mongol camp, you reveal part of the map around it, alongside all points of interest in the vicinity that appear as question marks. And if you free the whole region, then absolutely all question marks in that part of the island will appear. So now suddenly the explorative gameplay focused on noticing points of interest transforms into going to icons. And quite frankly, there is simply not enough activity types for an icon-based open world to work. Following foxes is cute and enjoyable, but when you do it for the 49th time to clear up that question mark, well, by that point it becomes quite repetitive as the activity lacks depth. It works in a context where you notice a den on your way and follow the fox, but not when you purposefully go to that location. Same applies to bamboo stands, quite nice little activities, but there's too many of them. Too many haikus to compose, too many collectibles to find, too many shrines with navigational challenges to reach them that are interesting at first but will eventually also become a bit repetitive as the navigational mechanics stop progressing after a certain point. Too many Mongol camps even, though the combat and stealth gameplay that leads to their liberation is absolutely fantastic, even if in time due to the number of set camps their level design can get repetitive, not because the areas are bad, but because there's only so many ways you can place yurts around an environment. The amount of all activities wouldn't have been a problem had their discovery be purely dependent on player curiosity, but in the context of everything eventually becoming visible on the map and actively calling players out towards them, well, that is a bit much. And the interesting thing about all this is that Ghost of Tsushima has quite a lot of unique encounters, essentially mini-quests that are unmarked on the map. They might revolve around helping a monk to dispose the bodies of people who have died from contaminated water, saving a village from a trebuchet or a wound from fire. There are a bunch of others that I personally haven't encountered myself, but I read about them online, and they're so memorable because you don't find them through markers, there is no journal entries, it all is fully integrated into the world and fantasy of the game. This is a perfect example of why an extensive use of icons doesn't work. It robs of that discovery aspect. But also there is benefit from the repeatable activities. A number of quests, like one where the Mongols are killing all foxes they can find, just wouldn't hit as hard if it'd not be doing the related activity. It doesn't help the perceived variety that the density of content is spread out unevenly throughout the world of Tsushima. The Act 1 region of Izuhara has the most collectibles, activities and quests. Toyotama, the region for Act 2, is already considerably less dense in that regard, and the final Kamiagata region is outright sparse. This leads to a weird situation where Act 1 barrages you with content so much that it wouldn't be surprising if in Act 3 you start feeling somewhat burned out. When it comes to missions themselves, which is really the bulk of content in Ghost of Tsushima, most of them naturally feature a lot of combat and stealth situations. Those are, after all, the most advanced tools the game has to offer. For the purposes of variety, other aspects like tracking, investigating and tailing are put in the mix. These other types of goals are done in a much more immersive way than usually happens in similar games due to the absence of any sort of detective vision for finding things in the environment. There is only hearing mode for highlighting enemies. So to track somebody you actually have to look for footprints and grass that was walked on. When investigating you have to notice which spots have something you might find interesting. This makes these actions more engaging than they otherwise would have been. While both main and side missions utilize the same toolkit, they all try to put it in context you wouldn't see before, in the Golden Path content especially. For example, there are several tailing missions in the game, but only in a single one during the main campaign will you tail a Mongol commander throughout the rooftops of a pretty big enemy-controlled city. Ghost of Tsushima regularly puts in little twists which keep things interesting. However, in that regard, the game has issues recontextualizing footprint tracking. This task also is presented in different contexts. There are times when you need to follow smoke instead of footprints, or search for fields of violet flowers and follow them, among some other ways. But I have to admit that the standard footprints in mud trope is utilized too much for the amount of recontextualization it has. The best Ghost of Tsushima quests are a perfect combination of core gameplay mechanics and narrative beats. For example, there is a mission where you have to save a number of captured civilians throughout town, and then, after gathering them all in the forge, protect them from an onslaught of enemies attacking you. This mission, focused on constant protection in different contexts, leads very naturally to the narrative beat of people starting to believe that you are indeed a ghost, a spirit with the goal of delivering vengeance to the Mongols.
I've never seen a samurai fight like that.
It was nothing.
You are more than a samurai. He is a vengeful spirit, back from the grave to slaughter the Mongols.
This narrative connection is what separates the better Ghost of Tsushima quests from the less interesting ones. However, since even the latter ones usually utilize the fantastic combat and stealth systems, well, they are rarely ever outright bad. What is more questionable is the inconsistent use of some mission design principles. For example, sometimes the mission puts in an artificial area limit even if it's not needed. The environment is properly limited anyway by using fortifications which you can't open until certain actions are done in the quest. Sometimes you're not allowed to stray far from an ally and have to stay close, at other times you can go around exploring. And yeah, in this first example I showed it is sort of justified by the urgency of the matter, but it's still jarring. Some quests can be a bit too restrictive with their progression. Like you can find tracks that you need to follow, but doing so will trigger nothing until you find all objects you had to investigate in the area, so you have to go back. There are times when you might find a quest-related location before the quest points you specifically towards it without taking your previous visit into account, so you have to go there again, but there are also quests that even change dialogue because you've completed something before starting the mission. It also should be noted that despite the game's insistence on using as little HUD and icons as possible, sometimes lack with these hurts the game, as ironic as it may sound. It can be difficult to understand what else the game wants you to find in an investigation area, the clues can be too subtle, as are the interaction markers when they're far away. Sometimes you might get a goal to destroy a powder keg cart in a Mongol camp, but the icon for the cart itself appears only when you're close. Which, when you have a pretty big camp with quite a lot of carts, only one of which actually has powder explosives, can transform this seemingly simple action into a process of running in circles trying to find in which corner of the camp that damn cart is. But all these aren't consistent problems you will encounter all the time. It's little flaws here and there that are annoying, yes, but ultimately none of them are met often enough or last long enough to ruin any sort of enjoyment. That's because, regardless of how flawed a quest might be, as mentioned, it will still have bright highlights focused on stealth and combat. Those systems alone provide so much depth and so many choices that you never feel like you've been doing them for hours and hours on end. Every time it allows you to be creative in new ways to master your skill set. Since that is the core of the experience, that is what matters most. And in general, the foundation for the open world and all the missions in this game is strong. So all flaws I've mentioned, even when taken together, don't have a considerable severity. And the big reason for that is pacing. When we talk about repetitiveness, it is incredibly easy to think about how these things might waste your time. But in Ghost of Tsushima, whichever aspect can be considered repetitive, doesn't. I used the fox dance quite a lot as an example of something that can get repetitive the more you find. But also it takes literally about a minute to complete one. So even though it can feel repetitive because going towards the question mark only to find out it's another den is not particularly exciting in the icon-based discovery context, it also isn't outright bad because at the core it is designed to be a nice 1-minute simple activity. This deliberate pacing is seen throughout the whole game. All the small activities take 1 minute to complete. Something bigger like a shrine takes 3 to 5 minutes. Every camp and side quests lasts about 10-15 minutes. Each main quest will take you about 20-30 minutes. This adds a certain rhythm to the experience that's very enjoyable. Similarly, every flaw with quest design is only a little blip of annoyance amidst content that, even when it's the worst you can find in the game, at the end of the day is fine. And that relativity is very important. I can literally name you the worst quest this game has. It's called Hidden in Snow, and while it has an intriguing plotline, the design manifests a lot of the problems I've mentioned. It's unclear where exactly in the building is Soda, then you have to investigate the village without knowing what you're looking for, which is annoying, but it also fits in terms of atmosphere. Then you need to go around different spots defined by the game, some of which you might have already visited during initial search, and then you have an encounter with the Mongols, which, as we've established, are always good. This single quest encapsulates all problems that Ghost of Tsushima missions might have, but in the end, it's not even bad, it's just fine. Because the annoyances never stay long enough to considerably damage your experience, the core gameplay systems are still polished, the quest ends on a high note anyway, and the narrative has supported the entire experience. So it's important to understand that while every flaw I've mentioned is something that ideally should be fixed, even when they're all taken together, they are greatly overshadowed by what the game does very well, including all the absolutely great quests, of which there is a big amount. Ultimately, Ghost of Tsushima is an incredibly focused game. Despite the open-world progression flaws that sometimes make the game feel a bit too repetitive, despite the inconsistently used design principles in some quests, this game never tries to be the biggest game ever with the most amount of mechanics and activities. Ghost of Tsushima has a clearly defined player role in the world, player fantasy to be embodied. You are a samurai transforming into the ghost. Everything the game has is laser focused on that premise with a purpose, and all that's most important for it to work is done in a very high quality. The combat and stealth systems are nothing short of incredible, full of progressively unraveling depth with absolutely tons of player choice, full of only valid decisions that you select based on your preferred playstyle. All quests are focused on supporting your people in their plight against the Mongols one way or another. All activities are either based on the notions of hardening one's mind or body, like hot springs and bamboo stands, Jin's personal beliefs, like the Shrines of Inari, or saving the citizens of Tsushima. Yes, there are too many activities of the same type for the ultimately collectible approach to its world progression the game takes. Yes, a number of side missions are not reaching the plank the game itself has set with its higher quality content. But none of that makes Ghost of Tsushima excel any less at what it's really good at. This is why, should we open up all the scores for design, feel free to pause if you'd like to read them all, I will assign a 9 to Ghost of Tsushima. It is truly an exemplary game. Exemplary in how to define the core of the experience, exemplary in how to represent that core through mechanics, exemplary in how to add layer upon layer of depth to those mechanics, exemplary in how to teach these systems to players and expand upon them throughout the experience. The way it tackles its RPG-based systems and the really high quality of most of its main quests. There are flaws, definitely, but all of them revolve around mostly supporting notions, and none of them make Ghost of Tsushima any less exemplary in what it does incredibly well. Now, let's move on to context. This category has the weight of 1 as it's all about things that usually enhance the experience rather than define it. Plot, motivation, character arcs, etc. Now, I have to start the discussion of this category with a heavy spoiler warning. I can't properly discuss the context of this game without going into spoiler territory, so if you want every narrative beat to be a surprise for you, skip to the aesthetics category. As we have established, the whole game revolves around the premise of a samurai going against his code and becoming the ghost so he could save his people. But we can't ignore the fact that this premise goes against the actual historical nature of the samurai, who in 1274 didn't have any sort of code to speak of. It's a much more modern invention meant to romanticize the caste that was very privileged and focused on taxing for rice more so than protecting the people who actually grow the crops. A samurai who follows the code of honor is, quite frankly, an unrealistic stereotype. However, Ghost of Tsushima uses this stereotype mostly for the purposes of creating an instantly recognizable for Western audiences foundation, only to then start deconstructing it. We view the world from the perspective of Jin Sakai, our protagonist, who truly believes that honor means protecting the weak and innocent.
What does honor mean to you?
I guess protecting people. The ones who can't fight for themselves.
You have a good heart. But first, we must show everyone that we serve our Lord with courage, integrity, and self-control.
You say that like it's easy.
It's never easy, Jin.
These beliefs are fueled by an incredibly large sense of guilt he feels for not saving his father when he was a child. As a way to cope with this trauma, Jin literally clings to the notion of never letting that sort of thing happen again, which is why he takes the samurai dogma at face value and is a full-on representation of a romanticized samurai. But the whole point of Jin's arc is that he eventually becomes the ghost. While of course at first this is manifested through going against the samurai code Jin believes in, attacking enemies from behind rather than fighting them with respect heads-on, using tricks and tools in combat rather than having a fair fight, taking the weapons of the enemy to use against them, and so on, Jin goes through the process of getting disillusioned by what it means to actually be a samurai. And here the most important character will be Jin's uncle, Lord Shimura. The two care very deeply for each other, but through the evolving relationship with Lord Shimura throughout the story, Jin experiences the hypocrisy of the samurai, his uncle including, who use the code of honor to protect their public image and power among the people. But in reality, they don't care about common folk. Lord Shimura was fully dismissive of Yuna, who has saved Jin's life and helped Jin rescue Shimura from captivity, because she was a thief. To the point that when Jin poisons the Mongol army, what is considered an incredibly dishonorable act, Shimura's first instinct is to tell him to blame Yuna for this.
I know. She drove you to this.
Uncle.
Renounce the ghost. You must blame her for this outrage.
And Jin performed this act of terror to ensure that no more people die in trying to retake Castle Shimura, people that Jitu was too eager to send forward to die as cannon fodder. And it's very clear why Shimura is so dismissive. A lot of these warriors were from Yarikawa, a region that back in the day tried to rebel against Shimura, but this attempt was put down. Shimura criticizes Jin for taking sides with thieves and rebels, but yet doesn't have any qualms with keeping pirate allies within his hand's reach, ready to call upon them when he finds it to be strategically useful. And for someone who keeps telling how samurai should always be in control of their emotions, Lord Shimura himself loses temper too easily.
The Mongols are on the defensive. We will strike before they regroup and end this war tomorrow.
You sent our men to die.
They are soldiers.
Their blood is on our hands. I can find a way past the bridge. Poison the enemy.
An act of terror.
I am trying to save our people.
By teaching them to fear us. If you continue down this path, you will be no better than the Mongols. I trained you to fight with honor.
Honor died on the beach. The Khan deserves to suffer.
You are ruled by your emotion.
I sacrificed everything I knew to save our people. I gave them hope. You did nothing! No. We're finished.
By the end of the game, the Shogun is very unhappy with the legend of the ghost that Jin has fostered with the help of his allies. The reason? Not because of any dishonorable acts, though of course that's the official statement, but rather because Jin has inspired people to fight for themselves and follow those who they believe in rather than those who they're told to serve. Jin's transformation into the ghost is not just about going against the samurai code of honor, it's realizing that this code of honor itself is a farce, just public-facing. However, despite the main story taking great lengths to deconstruct the romanticized version of the samurai, the ending of the game couldn't resist from summing it all up in a one-dimensional way for the sake of a cool line.
The Shogun has declared you a traitor.
He ordered you to kill me.
The Ghost was an outlaw. He taught our people to defy their leaders.
To defend themselves.
With poison. A gift you gave to our enemy.
I had to stop you from throwing away our people's lives.
You have no honor.
And you are a slave to it.
And you are a slave to it. This one line sounds especially weird at the end of the conversation, where Jin clearly has made it clear that honor has nothing to do with the rift between him and his uncle. It's a shame, because ultimately that's the line which is going to leave a lasting impression. We've already mentioned Yuna. She is one of the most important characters in this story. For all intents and purposes, she is the deuteragonist of the game, going through an arc of her own in parallel to Jin. The two characters start out at absolutely opposite parts of the spectrum. Jin is all about honor and fighting to protect the weak, while Yuna is there to show how privileged that position is and what she, as a commoner, had to do to survive. Run away from home with her brother, steal, use any method to survive, and her ultimate goal is very selfish. She wants to leave Tsushima to protect herself and her brother Taka. And yet both are catalysts for each other's growth as people. For all his bravado about protecting the weak, it can't go unnoticed that when Yuna at the beginning of the game admitted to Jin that she has saved him so he could help rescue her captive brother, Jin states that first they save his uncle and only then go after her brother. Yuna is the person who actually helped Jin anchor his motivation and show what it means to protect those in need. Plus, she is actually the one who came up with the idea of creating the ghost, transforming Jin into a living legend.
You are more than a samurai. He is a vengeful spirit, back from the grave to slaughter the Mongols.
Where do we hide now?
You don't.
Fire up a forge. And get back to making strong Komatsu weapons. That's how we fight back. That's how we'll save Lord Shimura. Vengeful spirit?
I think they liked it.
But from the other side, thanks to Jin, Yuna has learned how to fight for something greater than herself, becoming a very active figure in defining how to defeat Khotun Khan. So when the two share a conversation before the final missions where they admit how deeply they learned to care about each other, you truly believe that. And it should be noted without any actual romantic connotations, which is a trope I appreciate that Ghost of Tsushima has avoided.
I wouldn't be here without you, Yuna.
I can't lose you, Jin. After everything we've been through, everyone we've lost, I can't.
I have to stop the Khan.
No, you don't. We could find a boat, sail somewhere quiet, while your uncle fights his samurai war.
Do you really want that?
No.
If I fall, promise me you'll keep fighting.
You're a real bastard, Jin Sakai. You should get some rest.
Not yet. Let's sit just a little longer.
What's great about Ghost of Tsushima is that its themes are explored not just through the main storyline, but through pretty much all the side content too, and it's a game as much about Jin Sakai as it is about the people surrounding him. As such, Yuna is not the only person who becomes really close to Jin. He gathers a number of allies throughout the journey. Sensei Ishikawa, Masako Adachi, Norio, all these characters have proper arcs in their side quest lines and many parallels to Jin's main arc. And what's great about these parallels is that they're not on the nose, but rather subtle, adding to the discussion rather than mirroring it. As such, the questlines of Ishikawa and Adachi put on the forefront different fallacies, failures, and hubris of the samurai caste. Ishikawa's questline is focused on the search for Tomoe, a former Japanese student who has joined the Mongols, exploring the relationship between a teacher and a student who can be considered a failure in their eyes, which sits very nicely in a game where a similar sense of a failed student develops between Jin and his uncle. Adachi's questline focuses a lot on revenge, a goal Jin definitely feels towards the main antagonist Khotun Khan, and on family problems as well. Norio's questline is all about finding a purpose after experiencing survivor's remorse, so it is clear why he and Jin feel like kindred spirits in a way.
Everyone who rode south from Cedar Temple, all gone, except me. They deserve to live. I'm the one who should be dead.
I thought the same thing after Komoda. Many times. I don't know why we survived, Norio. But we did. And these people are counting on us. We're all they have. The people of Akashima are alive because of you. Don't forget that. Because they won't.
And all these characters at the end of their respective questlines are not going to be the same people we met them as, going through their own transformations together with Jin. What's more, even standalone quests with one-off characters feature little arcs for their participants. I also really appreciate how there's barely any side quest that is exactly what it seems on the surface. Maybe the woman who asked you to get back rice from bandits didn't have any rice in the first place, or bandits that might feel suspicious due to bias actually try to protect people who were left without a home. All this creates an incredibly rich and consistent world fabric. Whether you're doing a main quest or a side quest, you always feel like you're driving towards the same goal, exploring the same themes. However, throughout all this, I can't help but mention my disappointment regarding the game's handling of the Mongol invasion force. With the exception of their leader Khotun Khan, the Mongols are depicted as a purely aggressive animalistic force with absolutely zero attempts to humanize them. What's weird is that the Japanese citizens are not shown in purely good light. The game doesn't shy away to even get into the topic of pedophilic rape, an absolutely vile and heinous act.
Jin, what the Black Wolf said was the truth.
What do you mean?
I met him when we came to Otsuna. He offered me food and a place to stay. I asked if I could bring my brother. He got us drunk. And then... Taka doesn't remember. But I do.
So Ghost of Tsushima avoids the pitfall of transforming the defending people into a force of pure light, but still falls into the stereotype of transforming invaders into pretty much pure evil. That said, Khotun Khan is, for the most part, a very effective villain. His introduction is absolutely fantastic.
I am Harunobu Adachi, descendant of the legendary Yoshinobu Adachi.
He is cruel but also cunning and reasonable, a very interesting combination, and of course serves his purpose well as the leader of a force that can't be beaten in a traditional samurai way, acting as a catalyst for Jin to change. Though his introduction is great, during which he absolutely beats the shit out of Jin through gameplay, and the way his death is resolved fits greatly as a bookend, at the second stage of the boss fight he doesn't even deserve a health bar, being just one of many soldiers on the ship we're fighting on, which works great for the purposes of showing how much your character has developed in terms of skill, Cohesion loses his efficiency throughout most of the middle of the story. He usually sits in one castle or another and then suddenly leaves while just being attacked by us, going all your princesses in another castle route. It feels like a very forced way to transition the story into a new region. From an emotional standpoint, the game also doesn't handle another prominent character that well, Ryuzo. He's supposed to be our childhood friend with a hidden grudge that eventually leads to his betrayal. And while there are some very nice scenes between him and Jin, as a player you never really truly feel the sting of that betrayal, as Ghost of Tsushima didn't do nearly enough to set things up for a gut punch. Though I can't deny that the acting is sublime, you can clearly see Jin's pain, and that is the saving grace of this subplot.
I've lost everything. Except you. We can defeat the Mongols together.
After everything you've done!
Tell the people I was your spy. Sent to gain the Khan's trust. They'll believe the ghost.
Stop!
You are my oldest friend, Ryuzo. Surrender. And answer for your crimes. For both our sakes.
I can't.
And of course, the point I've mentioned in the design section about Act 1 having a lot of content, Act 2 less, and Act 3 very little, also affects the narrative pacing, as this issue is mirrored in the amount of both main and side quests. So Act 1 can feel very slow-paced because it has the longest main quest chain and the most side quests. Act 2 in comparison feels about right, while Act 3 feels very rushed. Though I do appreciate that in Act 3 there are people actively doing preparations for you, which does wonders to create a feeling that you have inspired people and are not fighting alone anymore. And ultimately, this is the biggest strength of Ghost of Tsushima's narrative. There is a reason why this category is called context. It's not just about the story, it's about motivation, world, consistency. Just like with its design, Ghost of Tsushima gives us an incredibly clear role and a very well-defined character. You feel Jin's motivation because you go through everything that has led to it yourself through gameplay. In the design section, I have mentioned how the game's best quests are a perfect combination of gameplay and narrative. So with that in mind, my favorite mission in the entire game is Ghost of Yarikawa. It is structured as a siege mission where you have to keep defending Yarikawa from an overwhelming Mongol force. First as one of many warriors defending the gates, then alone behind the enemy lines to destroy the catapults, and then you have to get back into the city, the defenders of which are losing their ground, resulting in a boss battle against the Mongol warlord. All game long, you have been fighting against a big amount of Mongol enemies, forcing you to hide, use tricks, sometimes run away. Now, in this middle section of the game, you're part of a large Japanese army, but the Mongol forces you're fighting against are even greater. And in the first part of this mission, you feel like you're pinned against an anvil that a hammer strikes over and over again. But after the boss battle, well, look, I gave the spoiler warning, so I'll just show you this scene that I hope you have experienced yourself. If not, last chance to skip to the aesthetics category.
Invaders! Look at your general! Run! Or this will be your fate! People of Yarikawa! Hunt every Mongol to the last man! Spare no one! For Yarikawa! For Yarikawa!
Stop them, your master!
us through! For the ghost! The ghost! Shoot! Push them back! For the ghost! Run, cowards! Yuna! We saved your town. Now, we help Lord Shimura save our island!
We are not soldiers!
Who killed these Mongols? Who stood against the siege? Who saved Yarikawa? We did.
You can't just stay here and wait for the Mongols to try again!
You say you are not soldiers. You are warriors. We can defeat the invaders and save our home, but only if we stand together.
The reason why this works is not just the music, the writing, but because it's the first time ever you've put Mongols on the run and you are actively chasing them as a player. Which is also the first time ever Jin feels like the tide has been turned. You and the character you play are one. And as an added bonus, from the gameplay side, this is actually how you learn to kill Mongol leaders with one hit from stealth. Before this moment, they were the only enemy you couldn't instantly assassinate, just use a critical strike against them. Of course, you could then use ghost tools like a sticky bomb to kill them without a long fight, but only after this moment in the story can you finally one-hit assassinate these kinds of enemies. Not just assassinate even, but slaughter, striking fear in your opponents. This is why, should you open up all the scores for context, I will assign a 9. There are considerable issues with handling of the main antagonists, the Mongol invading force, as well as the uneven pacing due to the game's open world design. There are also some issues with dialogue writing that I haven't focused on in this section, but for the most part those don't hurt the experience too much. But on the other side of the spectrum, Ghost of Tsushima not only gives every prominent character an arc while exploring interesting themes, it does something every great game narrative should do. Contextualizes your actions in such a way that you're in perfect sync with the character you're embodying. This is why the game's context is practically exemplary. Let's discuss aesthetics now. This is another category with the weight of 1, as it's again about things that enhance the experience rather than define it, this time through visual style, music, sounds, etc. Now, I suppose it goes without saying that Ghost of Tsushima is an insanely beautiful game. I mean, just look at this. The biggest reason why this works is the relative simplicity in texturing and model details alongside contrasting colors. First, whenever you look at the screen, it never feels too busy, almost like a painting. Your brain is not overwhelmed with information and stimuli. And then that is combined with a couple of contrasting colors, usually in the form of flowers or leaves. It creates a very pleasurable feeling seeing a field of white or violet flowers amidst the green. This contrast can be supplemented by different weather conditions that provide additional color variations. And it's interesting how the game is divided into different color areas, so to speak, which is noticeable when you climb up a viewpoint and take a look around the environment. You can find a golden biome, a red biome, a violet biome. Not only is this color differentiation striking when you're amidst those areas, it also feels beautiful and surreal when you're looking at them from a distance. This absolutely amazingly breathtaking scenery is magnified by the accompanying musical score. And accompanied is the precisely right word here. The way music is implemented in Ghost of Tsushima is very interesting. It takes center stage only during emotional story-based moments, be they represented through gameplay or cutscenes.
Uncle.
But all other times it's there to enhance the experience by representing what is going on but not distract you with its existence, even in the combat music, which is quite subtle relative to the intensity of that action. And there are two reasons for that. First is contrast. Because the overall musical arrangement of the game is not always in your face, when it is and a full range of instruments and maybe even vocalists plays, you really feel the contrast. It is outside of the normal experience. The second reason would be to make the music more systemic. Dynamic music is not a new thing, of course, but Ghost of Tsushima seems to have so many separately recorded musical layers for all the different locations, actions and moods that it's got to be one of the most impressive digital music dynamic systems I have seen so far. And I'm not talking about having different tracks for different states. I'm talking about having new instruments playing depending on what you're doing. The best way to show this system would be to take a look at a small infiltration section of the game when you're performing several stealth assassinations. Notice how with each kill there's additional instruments appearing in the music that are not separate stingers, but layers of the background track that go in and out, acknowledging your action but never making it in your face. And Ghost of Tsushima has such a system in place for a ton of actions. I've tried to make an extensive list after a lot of testing, but there is just a lot of elements in play. From whether somebody is in alert state or not, if someone is detecting you, how many enemies are there, maybe even what types of enemies are present. I'm not sure about that last one, though I wouldn't be surprised if it was, but the number of enemies in combat definitely affects the amount of layers playing in the fight music. Take a look at this section of gameplay and listen really closely to the music and notice what layers are added or removed depending on the ongoing situation. This is nothing short of fantastic. Simpler systems are also utilized, like for example in exploration, every activity has a particular stinger to its discovery. This is what plays every time you find a Pillar of Honor. But even exploration utilizes this dynamic layering system depending on where you are and what you have seen. It's insane how much work has gone into this aspect for it to remain as unnoticeable as possible on purpose. I have mentioned plenty both in the design and context sections how you and Jin are one, and this musical aspect only adds another layer to that fact by making it incredibly reactive to your actions. Sound design is fabulous as well, though the thing I want to mention most, which is also something I can't show an example of on YouTube, is how well the PlayStation controller speakers are utilized. Many developers avoid extensive use of it due to the, let's face it, pretty low quality of sound. But Ghost of Tsushima has found so many smart ways to utilize it, either for things that don't require high quality sound anyway, like the wind or different clings and clangs of sword in combat, or for things that enhance the atmosphere, like the vocals of the composing haiku activity, where the combination of the serene music on your normal speakers and the voice in the controller speaker creates a powerful combination of feeling like something is, well, happening in your head. It's great. There are so many other aesthetic aspects we could discuss, like how the UI is clean and stylish, and even its animations fit the overall visuals of the game. Just look at how different pop-ups transform into leaves that are then blown away by the wind. The gameplay animations are fantastic, and there are so many great details related to them, like cloth physics, which are incredibly important due to the amount of wind you'll be experiencing, and how whatever you wear reacts to mud, blood, water. And it's amazing how different you can feel after traveling for a while and after a battle, just due to how all these elements interact with your clothes. And the particles? By gods, the particle usage is amazing here, and this applies to both the violent and striking blood splatter particles, as well as the more peaceful and floaty leaves flying around nature. Anyway, I have to admit that by this point, me talking about the aesthetic part of Ghost of Tsushima is really just me mostly gushing about pretty much everything. It all is just so impressively done. So let's talk about a caveat, sadly. The character animation in systemic dialogue, or rather, lack of it. I've played the game with English voice acting, mostly because I figured that's the way the game was developed. And the voice work is great. I appreciate that this game doesn't have over-the-top stereotypical Japanese accents, which is a pitfall that's very easy to fall into when you make a game taking place in a country that doesn't speak English. And really, all the actors have done an absolutely amazing job in bringing their characters to life. Which makes it even more disappointing that the great voice acting will mostly be shown through very static characters.
I'm sorry about Lord Shimura. He was a good man.
He's alive. Taken captive by the Mongols.
Then there's hope.
That's why I've come. Help me save him.
I can't. My student is missing. A skilled archer.
I will help you look.
I mean, there is a distinct lack of animations there. But it would be unfair not to mention that the dialogue scenes which use the more directorial cutscene approach are done especially well. Just look at this.
Kenji spent the rest of the day wearing one sandal.
This is terrible.
My mother loved it. Used to drink it like water. She gets so mad when she ran out. Yelled at us. Where's my tea?
Sounds like a demanding woman.
She broke Taka's arm when he was 6. I took him away. Ran as far from her as we could get. We heard they found her a month later. Face down in the street.
You were brave to protect your brother. Sometimes, our only choice is to walk away from everything we know.
Anyway, if we are to open up all the scores for aesthetics, I will still assign a 10 to Ghost of Tsushima. In a game where everything from this aspect is done in an insanely high quality, a part of it that's not even outright bad but mostly disappointing is something that doesn't affect the impression negatively enough for there to feel like the game lacks polish. Ghost of Tsushima is not just beautiful visually, but it has a lot of systems in place to make the entire experience more connected. Which is a good segue into the Cohesion category. This category has a weight of 2, and it's all about how well the game connects all of its different aspects together into a singular, wholesome experience. Now, if you have been listening to all my points up until this part, you know what score this is going to get. What I will do now is throw in a couple more examples to prove my point. Let's take The Wind. It already is a solid and atmospheric solution for mission tracking on its own, but from a narrative standpoint, it also is what Jin considers to be a manifestation of his father's spirit.
Your father is the wind at your back. Your mother, the birds in the trees.
Now, not only is there a deeper meaning for the wind being in the game, it is a constant reminder of Jin's feeling of guilt and remorse, which in so many ways affects his eventual transformation into the ghost.
Father, how do I save him? A transformation that he will not always take lightly, by the way. You might be infiltrating a Mongol camp, silently disposing of the warriors inside, and then...
Jin! We looked them in the eye. With courage. Only cowards strike from the shadows.
Forgive me, Uncle.
Ghost of Tsushima is very committed to its fantasy. Pretty much everything that's in, every little detail and possible action is either based on the romanticized samurai notions that we did establish are at the foundation of this game, or who Jin is as a person. The more ghost actions you perform, the more the weather will change, from normal to cloudy to rainy to eventually a thunderstormy one. Nature itself is a representation of Jin's inner turmoil regarding his actions, and we feel that through how it affects the color gamma of the environment. However, you can play a flute in this game, and your music changes the weather, so you can sort of roleplay clearing up your mind after making a series of tough decisions. Special moves and heroic armor or weapons are found by listening to musicians recounting mythic tales about warriors of old, and you trying to separate the truth from the legend. After completing one quest or another, eventually you will find their participants in the world and can talk to them to check up on what happened after your initial encounter. After every quest you'll find Jin doing some sort of activity, which can include resting with his horse whose name you choose at the beginning of the game. You can end the suffering of mortally wounded enemy soldiers, bow to pay respects both to the dead and the living around you, who, the more you progress through this game, the more will approach you and have little dialogue lines as your legend grows stronger. And the world will react. Nature will react. Ghost of Tsushima is not a game that tries to immerse you by recreating concrete, accurate representations of the land, the historical events, and its people. It immerses you by setting up a mood. Ghost of Tsushima is not a photograph, an artistically enhanced capture of a moment in reality.
It's a painting, where reality is only but a suggestion. The focus is on the feelings you get through the use of colors and brushstrokes and what elements were included and which were purposefully excluded for the sake of those feelings that the artist wanted to show. Now, for the purposes of fairness, I do have to mention one very small caveat that does exist: how homes where people live have resources for you to freely take, like you would in a typical RPG where you barge in somebody's home and essentially rob them because you're a hero. That goes against the grain of the game and the main character. At first, thanks to the tutorial, I thought that the game was smartly setting up that only abandoned and ransacked houses would have resources to collect because they don't belong to anybody anymore.
We've got a long ride ahead. Take whatever supplies you can carry.
This is someone's house.
And they're not coming back.
But that wasn't the case. Still, it's a very little gamey abstraction that doesn't hurt anything, just a little sad that it's there. What balances that abstraction out in my book are a couple of tongue-in-cheek conversations in the game that play with the notion whether Jin enjoys violence and combat or not, as those systems are immensely satisfying for us as players. It's really cute in a "I see what you're doing" there way. In one case, we can even select our own reply.
What's it like to hold the power of life and death in your hands?
It's a heavy responsibility.
But you secretly enjoy it.
Only a monster would enjoy it.
That's not the answer I expected.
Let's open up all the scores for Cohesion. You know, I know that you know I will assign a 10. Ghost of Tsushima is an insanely holistic game that takes a particular premise at its core, and absolutely everything is revolved and interconnected around that core with layers upon layers in all those aspects. From the gameplay ones that we have discussed extensively, to how narratively all the different themes intertwine and how aesthetically the game makes your actions part of the musical score, every facet of the game helps you go through a transformation together with Jin, and very rarely does an open-world game, a narrative-focused open-world game to boot, manage to achieve this. But Ghost of Tsushima does. Let's get to our final category, emotions. This is the most subjective part of Stasocritic, but it has the second biggest weight, 3. This section is all about personal feelings, but personal feelings matter a whole lot and really are what will define a big chunk of your experience. I've been wanting to play Ghost of Tsushima ever since its release in 2020, but I also have been waiting quite long to get it. I actually didn't buy it myself. This was a Christmas gift from my wife, who knew I wanted to play Ghost of Tsushima, but that I kept pushing the purchase to some unknown future. Now, the reason why I've been sort of reluctant to buy the game is because of all the player and critic feedback that is sort of underwhelming. Look, I'm one of those people who doesn't judge a game until I play it myself, regardless of feedback. But when it comes to spending money, I've been hearing about Ghost of Tsushima feeling standard, derivative, repetitive, not having a particularly engaging story. All that gave me pause, and I had to carefully consider when I would like to pay for what I knew is going to be ultimately a fun game that you just have to try, but I didn't really know how engaged I would be by it. So I was sort of thinking maybe I should wait for a lower price point. Luckily, my wife has absolutely removed the dilemma out of the equation. And by Odin's beard, this is one of my most favorite games of all time. Look, I've 100%ed Ghost of Tsushima and platinumed it to the point that was beyond necessary for the game to be considered complete. I found absolutely all flags, Mongol artifacts, and even vanity items. Not because searching for collectibles is particularly exhilarating or anything, though not bad by any means of course, but because I just didn't want the experience to end. I wanted to spend as much time as I could in this world, which is really a stark contrast to so many other modern games that are huge and want to encourage you to spend as much time as possible in them, but you're not really into it, you know? The Ghost of Tsushima, it's really underappreciated. I mean, okay, I don't usually do this, but here are some quotes from a number of very well-known gaming outlets without any names because this is not supposed to be an attack. Ghost of Tsushima has a distinctive aesthetic, after all, but it's only skin deep. The core game underneath that alluring exterior is a pastiche of open-world game design standards from 5 years ago. It lacks a real personality of its own. Ghost of Tsushima is pretty as heck. Sporadic capturing left me with almost 50 GB worth of screenshots and short video clips to sift through, but at its core, it's just another open-world game. Limited by a rote and rigid world, Sucker Punch's samurai homage pairs okay action with enjoyably committed, if awkwardly fun melodrama. It has its moments, but like Jin Sakai in the opening hours, the past holds us back. It's open world, the video game. Open world, the video game. I myself have mentioned the dichotomy of Ghost of Tsushima's open world structure in the design section, but either due to the overabundance of AAA open world games in the market, or for some other reason I'm not sure, but people seem to ignore all the merits and craft that has went into creating this experience just because a lot of elements that it has are something that was present in other games. And yeah, it's true, they were present in other games, but also their implementation most of the time is not nearly as good as that in Ghost of Tsushima. If it sounds like I'm frustrated, it's because I am. The game somehow manages to be well received while staying extremely underrated, I just don't get it. When I started Ghost of Tsushima, I knew I would enjoy it, but I didn't have very high expectations for all the reasons I've mentioned before. But what actually turns out I have got is one of the best open-world action-adventure games I have ever played in my lifetime. It's insane what it does, it's insane how thoroughly and seamlessly it connects everything from design, narrative, technical, and directional standpoints. We need to reach a point in gaming discourse where we can appreciate craft as much as novelty, when something isn't inherently better if it's new or a reimagination of existing concepts, and another game isn't inherently worse because it has decided to iterate and polish upon established notions. Even though they're widely different games that do different things, I truly believe that Ghost of Tsushima deserves as much recognition as The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, for example. Because really, how many other games are there that do what Ghost of Tsushima does as fantastically as it does? I struggle to create a list. And there are so many games that I have played in my life and so many more that I still have to play, and a lot of the most beloved classics have not managed to create a constant feeling of awe while playing like Ghost of Tsushima did. There's just so many little things everywhere that were clearly, carefully implemented and iterated upon by the developers to transform this into an incredibly polished and focused experience. And yes, there are aspects that have to be improved, but in the grand scheme of things, they do not affect enjoyment in a considerably negative way. I don't know. Look, culturally related conversations aside, as that is a topic which deserves its own discussion, if a game like Ghost of Tsushima doesn't merit high praise, then what game does? How come there are so many games that have deep foundational, structural and gameplay issues but still are considered a genre or generation-defining must-play, and Ghost of Tsushima is just open world, the game? The world is backwards. There is also a second side of the coin related to my enjoyment of Ghost of Tsushima, and that is Assassin's Creed. I know this sounds weird, and no, I'm not going to say that Ghost of Tsushima is Assassin's Creed in Japan, because that's not entirely true. It is better than that. Ever since the release of the first Assassin's Creed, I have been a huge fan of that franchise that had great potential but also has been consistently disappointing for me one way or another. And look, I love those games, but every time there were constant cases of a couple steps forward in one area and a couple steps back in another. So not only did the franchise considerably change direction after the first game, it always felt like it could never quite get there, you know? At least at the time of writing this. Hopefully this statement will lose its relevance in the future. Ghost of Tsushima has evoked a lot of the same emotions, played in a lot of the same strings that the first Assassin's Creed had, and if you have watched my review of that game, you know how much I love it and how important it is to me despite all its flaws. While there are differences between the two in terms of details and mechanics, they have the same foundational principles in structuring a game around a particular fantasy and doing everything they can to implement that fantasy in a satisfying, holistic manner. And also, philosophy. Assassin's Creed is about two conflicting points of view. Ghost of Tsushima is really also about that, but within one person rather than between two secret organizations. There's actually not that many changes you would have to make to transform Ghost of Tsushima into an Assassin's Creed game, but all that's beside the point. What I wanted to say is that this game, without trying to be an Assassin's Creed, has managed to successfully reach a high quality in all the principles I would expect an Assassin's Creed game to have. But this is just a personal aside, as this video is not about Assassin's Creed, it's about Ghost of Tsushima. And if you open up all the scores for emotions, I will assign a 10. I've been just so enthralled by this quite frankly underappreciated game. It's amazing. At some points shivers literally ran up my body because of how emotionally affecting it was. And while I haven't done it yet, you know that at one point I will start a New Game Plus on lethal difficulty. There is no way that's not going to happen. So let's conclude this pretty long video. After taking all scores and their weights into account, Ghost of Tsushima gets a final Stasocritic rating of 95. It is absolutely fantastic, with some flaws in open world and quest design, as well as the mostly one-dimensional representation of the antagonistic force in the narrative being the only things preventing it from getting a perfect score in my system. If there is a sequel, hopefully it will achieve that. And if you have watched my other videos, you know that I don't praise anything lightly, even games that I absolutely adore. For the sake of consistency, I look at titles through a very critical lens that prevents even some of my most favorite games of all time getting close to a 90 Stasocritic score. And those that get higher than that really should be considered to be a golden standard for their respective genres or game subtypes. Should you play Ghost of Tsushima? Well, if you've been listening to me venting out a bit in the emotion section, by now you know that, yes, you absolutely do. I don't even know what else I can say that I haven't already. Should I repeat for the 11th or whatever time just how well the game implements the fantasy of a samurai becoming a ghost and sends us on this journey together with the protagonist not just through narrative but gameplay? You probably got the point by now. If you haven't played Ghost of Tsushima, it's a definite must play. If you have played it and did not enjoy it, well, I'm not here to invalidate anybody's opinions, they're yours for a reason. But if you have watched this video after playing and not enjoying the game, I would suggest getting back to it, but trying to do so without thinking about what other open world games do and focusing on what Ghost of Tsushima in particular does. Because what I see here is a magnificent game that perhaps is flawed, but is certainly going to be an inspiration for me as a developer. And I hope that to you, whether you are a developer or player, as well.